Hello, everyone. Today we have the pleasure and the honor to host the talk of Professor Fuchs on existential vulnerability. Professor Fuchs is Karl Jasper Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry at Heidelberg University, German. He completed his medical and philosophical studies at Munich University, and he is board certified in general psychiatry and psychotherapy. Professor Fuchs' research and clinical work focus on diagnosis, psychopathological assessment, and treatment of adults with severe psychiatric disorders. He has authored an incredible amount of articles and book chapters. We are around the number of 300 to give you a sense of it. And his recent publication is the book Ecology of the Brain. Certainly a book that is worthy to be read. It's published by Oxford University Press, 2018. Now, the floor is all yours. The students I can give you, the students and attendees, I will give you the floor at the end of the presentation.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much, Susie. I hope first everybody can see me. Second, everybody can see the screen of my presentation. I hope that is okay. Is it, Susie?
If not, you can text me in the chat. If you have problems with hearing or seeing the presentation, you can send me a note.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay. My topic is, as a kind of unusual term, existential vulnerability. You might be aware of the term vulnerability in other contexts, such as vulnerability for certain diseases, vulnerability in the sense of biological, genetic vulnerability. But we will talk about an existential aspect of vulnerability to mental illness. And this raises the first question. Why is it that human beings can become mentally ill at all? And I won't certainly give an exhaustive answer to this question, but a first approach might suggest that human existence is characterized by an inherently vulnerable structure, which may lead to alienation, to disintegration, as we encounter it in psychopathology. Self-alienation is the hallmark of mental illness, and it is somehow prefigured in the precarious and unstable condition of the human subject, which has a fundamental split, so to speak, the fundamental split of being in relation towards himself, and by being self-conscious relates to itself, but also escapes itself at the same time. And this creates a fundamental tension within us and already bears the germ of an alienation. And this alienation has to be constantly bridged, so to speak, by the subject's engagement in the world. So in short, existence as a self-transcendence is the continuous movement which is driven by our basic instability, our basic unrest, and by a self-alienation in statu nascendi, so in the state of becoming, that we have to overcome continuously. Well, that is a rather abstract introduction, I'm aware of that, but it will become more concrete in what follows. By the way, if there's anything you don't understand either acoustically or in terms of meaning, you could, of course, interrupt me, it's no problem. Also, Susie, if you think that it is too quick or whatever, you tell me. Okay? Now, the vulnerability I want to emphasize is of an existential kind. And I refer here to the major German psychopathologist, Karl Jaspers, who's normally better known as a philosopher, but actually started as a psychiatrist and a pathologist. And he wrote in his famous General Psychopathology, for man, his incompleteness, his openness, and his freedom and interminable possibility itself become the cause of illness. One might also say only human beings have to lead their lives, and only human life can fail. So this leading one's life, this openness, this crucial importance of making one's decisions and so on, this already is a kind of vulnerability. Now, existence is, for Karl Jaspers, the being of a person at the limit. Existence, or Dasein itself, does not belong to the sphere of phenomena. That means to the sphere of that which is directly given. It can only be paraphrased, looked at from the side, so to speak. But limit situations represent, according to Jaspers, the pronounced or the emphatic possibility for becoming aware of one's existence. So indeed, he writes, experiencing limit situations and existing are one and the same. Now, this concept of limit situation has a central position in Jaspers' philosophy, in particular for the project of elimination of existence, Existenzerhellung. And in view of that, it's just a bit surprising that limit situations play only a minor role in Jaspers' psychopathology. And the question is whether the psychopathological content of this concept has not been largely remained unexplored. And in what follows, I will first give a short explanation of the concept, and I will then examine how we can make it fruitful for psychopathology and for psychotherapy. And my thesis will be that persons who are prone to experience mental illness show a particular sensitivity or vulnerability which makes them experience even everyday situations and inconspicuous events as limit situations. And in such situations, an otherwise hidden fundamental condition of existence becomes manifest for them, and this fundamental condition is found unbearable and as a reaction gives rise to mental illness. I will also illustrate this concept by some clinical examples or case studies. Let me look at Jaspers' concept in a bit more detail once more. Jaspers' concept of limit situation presupposes another notion, namely the basic situation, which characterizes human existence in its particular contradictions and also in its finitude. To these basic situations belong the situations of having to suffer, having to fight, being at the mercy of blind coincidence, facing the inevitability of guilt, and last not least, having to die. And consequently, we have suffering, fight, contingency, guilt, or death as fundamental conditions or basic situations of life. Jaspers sees the precondition of limit situations in this fundamental and, as he calls, contradictory structure of Dasein, antinomical structure of Dasein. That means those contradictions of life that one cannot remove, and which in the end one must simply live with. But normally, these basic situations remain in the background of our lives. And they only become limit situations if they transform into distressing experiences for the individual. In limit situations, the basic contradictory structure of existence comes to light, and in this respect, they have an uncovering nature. They uncover basic conditions. And here, something gets broken, which Jaspers calls the housing. Something gets broken in every limit situation. The rug is, so to speak, yanked from under my feet, Jaspers writes. And what is broken or getting lost here is the housing, the Gehäuse in German. Such housings or shelters are consolidated structures of thought or fundamental attitudes which offer protection from the limit from the limit, and security with regard to existential questioning. And one might also call them existential defense mechanisms. Now, housings may be explicit, religious or ideological worldviews, which lend meaning and comprehensibility to the world. But they may also be implicit, rather commonsensical assumptions about life, about oneself, about the world. Assumptions which hide the contradictions of existence by constructing harmonious conceptions like the following. Let me formulate some of these implicit basic assumptions. First, the world is set in a fundamentally just manner. If I only strive enough and do nothing wrong, this will finally be rewarded. This is the housing or the existential defense mechanism of the melancholic type personality, a personality which is particularly prone to suffer from severe depression. Another basic assumption: if I subordinate to others, I can count on their shelter and guidance, though that would be the dependent defense. If I do everything the perfect way, life is under my control and I cannot be taken by surprise. Fate cannot harm me. And this would be the perfectionist or anancastic defense. And finally, if I move up and achieve more and more, I will be invulnerable. And death somehow can't really affect me. And thus, that would be the narcissistic defense. Well, as we see, such basic assumptions often follow the pattern that there cannot happen what may not happen. So evil, injustice, coincidence, and death may exist, but they cannot really affect me. I haven't done anything. I'm innocent. I'm special. Different personality structures, dependent, avoidant, anancastic, narcissistic, are characterized by different housings or existential defense mechanisms. A particular housing, which I already mentioned, is found in the melancholic type personality, the personality found by the Heidelberg psychiatrist Tellenbach to be prone to fall ill from severe depression. Its characteristic features are rigid orderliness, conscientiousness, selfless fulfillment of duties, an over-adaptation to social norms, clinging to symbiotic social bonds and commitments, and avoidance of norm violation or guilt at any price, so to speak. However, this rather rigid housing of assumptions and expectations finally proves precarious. For if persons with such a personality once fall short of their duties, or if they experience unjustified rejections or losses of significant others, then their world, their housing, literally collapses. They find themselves in a limit situation, and a severe depression may be the consequence. So, as we can see, the paradigmatic characteristic of a limit situation is the crumbling or collapse of the housing, of a shelter of assumptions and expectations, which have shown or which have provided a false sense of security. And I quote Jaspers once more: the conscious experience of the limit situation, which was previously concealed by the secure housing and the commonsensical forms of life, lets a process begin which brings the hitherto taken for granted housing to dissolution. Now it becomes more or less clear what the housing is, and this is experienced as attachment, limitation, without possessing the strength for offering a secure foundation. Because limit situations question the very frames of interpretation, they are not something one can anyhow anticipate or even less calculate. We are also unable to overcome limit situations by rational strategies. Rather, as Jaspers writes, only through a totally other activity, the becoming of the possible existence in ourselves. We become ourselves in that we enter the limit situation with open eyes. In seizing one's existence, as Jaspers writes, a person decides for a path of action or of life, while being aware that other possibilities will not be realized, also being aware of his or her responsibility. And this is for Jaspers the highest form of human freedom, namely to enter into limit situations, to bear up against them, and thus to gain support for the leap to one's own existence. Limit situations thus offer the person the possibility of being authentically oneself, and thus with their inescapable freedom and this with in one with their inescapable freedom and responsibility. Now, so much for Jaspers' concept of limit situation. What importance can it have for psychopathology? I already pointed out at the beginning that persons with a predisposition for mental illness show a particular existential vulnerability. That means a heightened sensitivity or fragility, which leads them to experience seemingly insignificant events as limit situations. And in such situations, an existentially basic condition becomes undeniable, a condition which was so far kept concealed. For example, the fact that becoming guilty is unavoidable, the inescapability of freedom, the frailty of one's body, the mindness, the fact that one's existence is not substitutable. It's fundamentally, in a sense, lonely. No one can substitute me, can unburden me from having to be myself. And finally, the relentless finitude of existence. And this confrontation with basic conditions is unbearable for those affected and leads to the manifestation of mental illness if the situation is not overcome by other means. Now, this vulnerability is not an objective variable of the personality. Rather, it is also subjectively experienced as an ontological uncertainty. And therefore, existentially vulnerable persons establish themselves in a housing of defense strategies, precautions, safeguards, in order to escape, to avoid the confrontation with limit situations, with isolation, guilt, finitude, death. However, the walls of this housing are thin. The patients remain hypersensitive or vulnerable regarding the existential implications of certain life situations in which, as it were, ruptures in the housing open up. Now, I give some examples of this particular vulnerability. The first is the vulnerability regarding one's own body, the vulnerability of the hypochondriac person. It consists in a particular sensitivity for one's susceptibility to disease, one's proneness to injury, to the frailty of the body. The hypochondriac person tries to banish the permanently present sense of danger from disease and death by anxiously monitoring every bodily event. So he insists on the goal of having complete control over his body through constant preventive diagnostic measures. The neurosis of hypochondria becomes an often lifelong struggle against a basic condition of life, which is not exempted but negated. Also, acute mental illness, such as a severe depression, can emerge from the existential implications of a physical disturbance, so from a vulnerability to the frailty of one's body. And as an example, I offer a case history. A 54-year-old patient fell ill to a delusional depression half a year after his retirement. Already the end of his career had caused him much discomfort and trouble. The triggering event of the depression was the extraction of 3 teeth and the fitting of a poorly precisioned prosthesis. The patient grew up in a family of moderate means in which sickliness remained prevalent. He reported about them somewhat contemptuously. He himself had worked his way up the ladder to becoming a sales manager for a large company through very hard work and utmost ambition. His wife reported that the job always came first for him, which brought about much suffering for his family and marriage. Over the course of 45 years on the job, he took only 10 sick days. Now the depression was marked by a feeling of collapse and ruin. All his strength, the patient complained, was gone. His arms and legs would no longer obey him. He had failed to take care of his family and was now paying the price for it. Life, he thought, was over for him. In the further course, delusional ideas developed. Drops of sweat signaling his death, he thought, ran down his forehead. One could already see livor mortis discoloring his face. One should move him to a basement morgue and leave him there. Now we can see here how a rather minor bodily event may even turn into a limit situation, given a particular sensitivity for its existential meaning, such as the extraction of the teeth. For the patient, this became a sign of frailty, a sign of the end of the lifelong narcissistic ascent to ever higher means, to ever higher goals. And this was unbearable for him. Life, in a sense, was literally over for him, and he fell into depression as a reaction to this unbearable limit situation. I want to add only briefly here that, of course, one's bodily existence can give rise to limit situations in very different ways. For example, anorexia. Okay, that is something anorexia in young women can be conceived as denial of the basic conditions of one's dependency on a physical, libidinous, and uncontrollable body. Here it is the fact that I'm forced into a determined gender role by my own body, and that I'm not free when it comes to answering its needs. I'm forced to nourish my body, and that I'm not free, and that I can oppose myself to my body, but nevertheless remain inextricably connected to it. This dichotomy, based on the ambiguity of the body, becomes an unbearable limit situation for women with anorexia. And this condition is what they try to deny and to counter by striving for a systematic disembodiment. For persons with hypochondria, the primary affects are fear and concern for the body. Whereas on the contrary, for persons with anorexia, it is the repelling effect of disgust, which expresses the basic condition of one's dependence on the body. So disgust results from attention to the body's despised materiality, including above all its nourishment, So that ugly stuff that I'm finally made of. I now want to move to another type of existential vulnerability, which corresponds to the basic condition of freedom. Here it is the fact that every decision is finally arbitrary, not ultimately justified, and that its consequences are unforeseeable, which may throw specifically vulnerable persons into an existential anxiety. The extreme sensitivity for situations of decision is found mainly in anarchistic or perfectionist persons. For them, the transition from a state of abundance of possibilities to the determination of reality turns into a limit situation, even in harmless decisions. Consideration becomes endless, spontaneity of the decision goes missing, and even if the decision is eventually made, it is ultimately not held. A further case history for this. A 33-year-old dentistry student was seeking psychotherapy because his final examinations were imminent, and he was no longer capable of preparing himself with full concentration. He had been suffering for years from an obsessive-compulsive disorder, which extended from constant brooding over compulsive thoughts to compulsive controlling. Again and again, he had to think through whether he reached the right decision a few days back. He always regretted his decisions and criticized himself for them. This made even the act of shopping an agony, for he spent hours going back and forth between the varying products. And even if he finally made his choice, he would brood over whether he should have actually bought some other article instead. So I always think that I'm on the wrong track and I want to go back to the decisive moment. Recently, he had been gripped more and more by panic because many difficult decisions waited for him in connection with the finishing of his degree. Now, this patient obviously could not handle the uncertainty and simultaneously finality that comes with every decision. He wanted to stop time, one could say, and make nothing become past or gone. Not only because he despaired about a specific decision, but rather because of the fact that one possibility must become irreversibly realized at all. And thus the finishing of his degree became a limit situation. For the new realm of possibilities that it opened up did not mean a step towards more freedom for the patient, but on the contrary, the fear of the abundance of possibilities. And thus, in a sense, it triggered an existential agoraphobia, a fear of too many options. Now, third, a housing or defense structure that serves the avoidance of freedom and the avoidance of guilt as much as possible can be found in the melancholic type, which I already mentioned. As we have seen, such persons are characterized by orderliness, selfless fulfillment of duties, close, often symbiotic relationships to significant others. From an existential point of view, this rigid structure serves an avoidance as well. The moral, irreproachable behavior, striving to hold oneself in the boundaries of the established order, has the deeper sense of a protection against the inevitable minus of one's existence. That is to say, it protects against the isolation which is called by freedom. Indeed, it protects against the groundlessness of one's own existence in general. The constant care for others should neutralize one's guilt, which, according to Jaspers, is itself given with existence. Our life goes on constantly at the cost of others. Every decision also brings with it the guilt for rejected possibilities. Even our existence itself is not a justified part of the world. It is, in a certain sense, lacking justification. It is guilty as such. Now, with patients, who belong to the melancholic type and are particularly vulnerable for these conditions of the existence, a dilemma surrounding decisions can result in acute depressive illness, as in the following case. A 55-year-old woman fell ill because she tortured herself with the decision of whether she should sell her house, which had become too large for her after the death of her husband. And influenced by advice from friends and family, she in the end sold her house. However, she soon experienced a serious crisis in which she bitterly regretted her decision, criticized herself intensely, and finally fell into a deep depression. She complained relentlessly about her wrong decision. She was convinced that she had suffered an irreparable financial loss. She had irreversibly damaged her children and was indeed incapable of completing the move. Now, after the alleviation of the acute illness through therapy, it came to light in the further psychotherapy that two aspects of the decision of selling the house were particularly unbearable for the patient. First, its irreversibility, which was connected with the ultimate acceptance of the death of her husband, with whom she had lived in the house for over 20 years. And second, it was the first time that she had made a life-changing decision without her husband. And this revealed her loneliness and her unavoidable self-responsibility. Now, this patient was obviously sensitive in a special way. She was vulnerable to the irreversibility, the self-responsibility, and the loneliness tied up with every decision. And for the melancholic type in general, the loneliness of decisions represents a fundamental disappointment. Despite all precautions, he cannot or she cannot escape the burden of living her life alone and unsecured without any guarantees. So the descent into depression is a response to an experience in which the futility of all avoidance and all safeguarding strategies is revealed. So whatever had stayed hidden behind the housing is now lamented about in depression. There arises the patient's excessive self-accusation for being irreversibly guilty, and in place of symbiotic relations with others, there arises the complaint about one's intractable loneliness. So we have seen three examples of this particular vulnerability, and I want to summarize my considerations in some sentences. Anthropological psychiatry seeks an answer to the specific vulnerability of human beings. So what are the conditions of possibility for us to fall mentally ill? And anthropological psychiatry gives an answer which is related to the particular sensitivity of patients for existential situations, where they can be faced with fundamental questions, and this due to seemingly trivial or everyday events. Can I depend on the intransparent functioning of my body? How should I know what my place in the world is? Why do I finally have to depend on myself? How can I justify my existence? Can I live with the guilt that comes with every decision? Can I endure the wasting of myriad possibilities, since I can only live this one life without any authoritative guidance? How can I escape fatal coincidence? And do I want to even engage in this world with its contradictions and with its inevitable destination being death? Well, it is clearly not primarily philosophical considerations that bring about such questions. In most cases, the patients would not be capable of formulating these questions even explicitly. Rather, it is fundamental affects, existential feelings and moods that arise out of disturbing situations, which already imply these questions pre-reflectively. So these are angst, feelings of existential guilt, shame, nausea, emptiness, boredom, or feelings of foreignness, alienation. Existentially vulnerable persons sense the depth of these affects and moods more than others, and try to escape the existential worry that is caused by these affects. And they try to escape and avoid these affects by a housing of everyday precautions and avoidances. And yet the housing only provides an apparent security. Indeed, inasmuch as it weakens the person's existential resilience, they are even more helplessly exposed to the occurrence of limit situations. Now, with this existential background, psychotherapeutic approaches will try to use limit situations as occasions for a deeper self-understanding, and as occasions to lead the patient to an openness for the basic situations which these situations imply. The psychotherapist will accompany the patients and support them first in accepting the limit situation without avoidance. Jaspers already warned against over-hasty attempts to make the limit situation vanish by denial, repression, or rationalization. The challenge and the therapeutic chance lies precisely in withstanding the pressure for harmonization. And this is what gives the opportunity to help the patient recognize their sheltering housings or rigid defense structures. And this happens in deliberate awareness of the failure of all attempts towards solution which have so far remained inside the housing. And in the crisis usually have followed the pattern of more of the same. So patients usually react to the threat of existential anxiety by more compulsion, more orderliness, more clinging to others, more struggling, more achievement, and so on. A deeper insight and change of attitude will only be possible through what Jaspers has called existential illumination, or shedding light on one's existence. And this may lead for the first time to an insight and acceptance of the basic conditions of life, which the patient has neglected or denied so far. For the anancastic person, it is the fundamental contingency and unpredictability of the world. For the melancholic type, it is the insight that he cannot expect an ultimate justification for his existence, and that his rigid fulfillment of norms and duties cannot substitute his own identity. For the dependent, avoidant person, it is the necessity of choosing oneself as an autonomous subject with his unescapable freedom. And for the narcissistic personality, it means accepting one's limitations, one's normality, one's banality, one could even say, and of course one's vulnerability and finitude. If these basic conditions are recognized and accepted, this may result in finding a new, more self-responsible way of leading one's life. Okay, I think these considerations may suffice for at least indicating that one could really develop a psychopathology and psychotherapy of limit situations. It seems to me that the task of a psychiatrist and psychotherapist should include gaining what may be called competency for limit situations, not least through one's own existence, one's own decisions and failures. Only then will we be able to help our patients recognize the existential implications of their crisis and understand the situation not only as a self-caused misfortune, but rather also as an expression of the human condition in general, in which we all participate and through which we all suffer. An existential solidarity is what I think is appropriate for this kind of communication between psychotherapist and the patient. And this existential solidarity and sharing can wake in the patient the strength to bear the situation, to cope with it, and possibly even to use it, in Jaspers' terms, as for a leap to freedom, to more authentically being oneself. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I think we can go on to have a discussion then, or now, as I understood you, Susie.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was very rich and useful. It triggered many questions for me, but I want to give the precedence to my students and the other attendees.
Yeah.
So if there's anyone who wants to ask a question to Professor Fuchs, please let me know via chat or raising your hand if you have the camera on.
I have two questions tied together.
Yes.
First, you have referred to the more sensitivity to existential situations coming to the foreground, the basic conditions of human life, not being at home. And these features, regarding these features, do you see any association between engagement in philosophical activity and the rise of mental illness first? And second, if just the acceptance of the basic conditions of life would eliminate
this is lost. Yeah.
Human suffering.
I didn't get the final part of the second question. Of if insight in the basic.
You have referred to the acceptance of the basic conditions of life as a psychotherapeutic element.
Yeah.
Do you see it is sufficient to eliminate the human suffering to, for example, heal a person who suffers from basic conditions of human life, or not? Just if you just accept the basic conditions of human life, is sufficient?
Yeah, I see. Well, regarding the first question, I don't think that a deeper engagement into philosophical thought or philosophical questions is actually what could bring a person to fall ill from mental illness. There are, of course, a number of people who enter philosophy and who try to solve their existential questions by going into philosophy, and they might have fallen ill in any case. So this is not caused by philosophy, but by a more basic instability, which is the reason for the illness, and has also led to the attempt to find more security by engaging with philosophical literature. So I don't think philosophy is something which can make you, which can somehow undermine your existential security. I wouldn't claim. I wouldn't go that far. This insecurity has another source. Regarding the second question, of course, insight into the basic conditions of life is not sufficient to avoid all kind of blows of fate, and to avoid all existentially challenging situations. And it may not even be enough to avoid recurrent mental illnesses that are to a large extent also of a bodily and biological nature. So I wouldn't go that far. But what insight into basic conditions and into the existential meaning of these situations could foster in the patient is a kind of affirmation of oneself, a kind of self-strength and security that allows the patient to go more open, to confront himself more open with the basic conditions of life, and thus to strengthen his resilience, as I put it. The existential resilience is something that we could support. This won't abolish a mental illness, of course, but it will give the patient more strength against the challenges of existence, against the unavoidable conditions, and even more strength against the challenge of human finitude. I think we can we can support that, but it won't help to abolish or somehow to avoid any mental illness, of course.
But don't you think that philosophers are more sensitive to human basic conditions? And this
in many cases, yes. Sensitive means in this, in my understanding now, means they have more. They should have more insight into these existential conditions, but they are not necessarily more vulnerable towards them. Sensitivity in this case means having a feeling, having an insight, self-reflective stance towards one's life, which may be helpful in many cases, but it's not the same as this kind of over sensitivity in the sense of vulnerability. That's a different thing.
Thank you.
Are there more questions? Okay, I see one in a chat. Jagrob, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, I'm sorry. So he says, first off, I would like to thank Professor Fuchs for this webinar. I found it very interesting and enlightening. I would like to ask, what role do you believe that religion plays in the acceptance of the basic conditions of life?
Oh, okay, that is an interesting question. Of course, religion is one of the major defense mechanisms that mankind has invented against the existential threat of the basic conditions. So religion is a collective shelter, one could even say a collective housing that keeps its members or its believers from being exposed to the existential loneliness. And I think it can serve, and it has for centuries, as a kind of stabilizing cultural institution, and stabilizing people against this existential threats, this existential anxiety. But nowadays it has become difficult for the individual, I think at least for individuals in the Western world after Enlightenment, to just enter into this housing with full belief. I think it is much difficult today to just accept this, accept the rules and doctrine of, for example, Christianity or any other religion, and this may raise the question of authenticity. if this housing is just adopted in order to use it as a defense mechanism, I think it is problematic because it won't hold. It's just something that you take on as a guise, so to speak, as an external belief system, but you're not really incorporated any longer. And then it won't help very much. I think today it's much more difficult to identify with a religion in the sense, in the way that former generations could do. I think it's the existential stance towards the limit situations for many individuals in the Western world must be a different one. And that is all I can say. I don't want to go into more detail in this difficult question.
I don't know if you have... yeah, there's a follow-up question.
Yep.
So, would you believe that religions are actually bad for humans since it can be used as a defense mechanism in the form of a community housing? Or do you believe that every religion is a community housing or a particular one? And I add my follow-up question too, which is if there's no... if this housing is a little bit falling apart now, what do you think, where do you think people are going? What is the replacement?
No, I would certainly not regard religion as a generally problematic housing in the sense of merely hiding the existential truth from people and keeping them somehow in a shelter that is illusory. I certainly don't think that. But on the other hand, it is clear that religion also had very rigid structures and very rigid doctrines that were obviously necessary to somehow stabilize the human vulnerability, or to stabilize people against these existential threats. And as regards the ultimate aim of this existential approach, I think you have already seen that is very much related to the idea of human freedom. So insofar as a shelter or a housing leaves enough freedom to change your ideas, to change your way of life, and to be open towards possibilities of existence, possibilities of self-realization. In that sense, or to that extent, I think a housing is very important. But on the other hand, you have seen that the housings of patients are very rigid. They don't leave enough freedom to react towards all different situations, towards also challenging situations. These housings are very rigid, very strict, so to speak, and in that sense, they don't leave enough freedom. So I think the idea of freedom is something like a I don't know the English term, something you need to evaluate the worth and the value of a housing or of a common or shared housing, because the value of a housing depends on whether there is enough freedom for you to develop, freedom to interact with life, so to speak. And in that sense, also religion may on the one hand be a rigid and problematic housing. On the other hand, it may be a shared housing that leaves enough freedom for the believers and for the members of the community to lead their lives together, to be solidaric, to be solidaric? No, they don't. to share their lives in a free way, in a free sense. Okay.
Does that answer your questions? And if you have follow-up questions, just let me know through the chat. So, yeah, there is a follow-up question here.
Okay.
If a particular religion allows a person to accept the basic conditions of life, would it still be considered as a housing? What would be the difference between that religion and a mindset that is considered healthy due to it allowing a person to accept the basic conditions of life? And he thanks for your answers and apologizes for keep asking, but I think this is exactly the goal of this gathering. So
no, there's no need to apologize. But you see, it's not so easy to answer these questions, because the question of religion is very much a question of what kind of religion, and also what state of development of religion we're looking at. There are very dogmatic and strict and rigid systems of which may certainly be regarded as problematic housings, and there are, on the other hand, rather farther developed forms of religion who are open to the basic facts of life, and who don't just conceal them. And I could say, of course, that is a bit personal question now, or personal opinion now. I think the question whether religion somehow conceals the fact of death by harmonizing everything. Well, it's not a problem. You will see all your relatives again. Death is a wonderful thing, because then you open your eyes and you enter into the real world, and in the real world you will find the relation to God, and you will find all your relatives again, and everything will be like in a fairy tale, so to speak. I'm not that sure if I could believe that, and if it's not something that I would call an existential defense mechanism in the sense of an illusion that somehow blurs my critical thought. On the other hand, if a religious system accepts the fact of death and leaves open a kind of hope for a potential afterlife, maybe an individual, maybe a kind of afterlife within God or whatever, without harmonizing death, without somehow extincting death because it's not really a problem. I think such a kind of religion seems to me much more adequate for our present state of the development for our present state of human consciousnness or human culture. So in that sense, I would think the issue of death would be like a proof of whether a religion is just a harmonizing, illusory system, or whether it really helps you to face death and to somehow be open, at least for a possibility that there is a meaning in life which overcomes or transcends death. Well, that would be a personal opinion.
Thank you. So in case you have other questions, just let me know. You can ask the questions yourself, of course. If you have problems with microphones or any sort of problem, I can read your questions always. while I'm waiting for other questions to come, I will sneak in with one of my questions. Well, yeah, I will privilege the curious one. So I was just curious to know, how did you help the ex-manager in depression? So, yeah, once he came in contact with his existential truth, his vulnerability, and so on, what happened? I'm curious to know about the steps of that story.
Well, the first was, of course, the treatment of the acute delusional depression, because a delusional depression is not something that you can treat in an existential way. You have to treat it by psychopharmacology, and to wait until the delusion, even by neuroleptic drugs, and you have to wait until the delusion subsides and the patient is able to enter into a psychotherapeutic process again. So that is the first step. The next step is alleviating the depression to a degree where the patient can start to look at his life in a way that is not just distorted by depression and brings only unnecessary guilt feelings and self-reproaches to the fore. So that is not the basis for psychotherapy. And the psychotherapy can only start when there's a realistic view on one's life, which is not distorted by by exaggerated self-reproaches. And then, when that happened, the patient was recovered to at least a certain extent. Then, of course, we looked at his life and history, and we looked at the unlived life, so to speak, that the patient also realized to a certain extent. So, what did I miss in this life? What was the price I had to pay, or that I wanted to pay? How can I somehow integrate this unlived life into my future life again? How can I compensate for what I've lost, or what I've missed, or what I've perhaps failed to do to my family or to my wife? All this became a topic, an issue for psychotherapy. So what is the negative, the dark side, so to speak, or the hidden side of my life that becomes somehow, that comes to the fore in this existential crisis? So what is the possible gain of this crisis? How can I use it as a means to lead a more integrated, a fuller life in the future? Of course, it was necessary in any case, because the patient was already retired, and the lifelong ascent towards even higher and higher goals was no longer possible. But this made it possible for the patient to accept this condition, and increasingly, and to ask for the potential gain, or for what can be integrated into his life right now, when this condition of life shows that there is no longer an ascent. And that was along psychotherapy, which led the patient to lead a more, I would say, a more relational life. He became a more relational person, one could say, and that was something that his relatives, his family, and his wife cherished very much, of course.
I can imagine. But was he with narcissistic traits, or?
Yes, yeah, that was certainly narcissistic traits. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you. that's yeah, an interesting piece to know, because yeah, once we arrive, once we are capable of facing the existential truths and looking at our existential vulnerabilities, then there's the opportunity for the real self to meet our real self. So I was curious about, okay, how does it look like, this real self? For example, in the case
this real what?
Self.
The real self. Okay.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems from your answer that a healthy relational self capable of producing meanings in life is a sort of a balance in this search.
Yeah. Yes, one could say. Well, I'm not. I'm a little bit skeptical about regarding the notion of a real self or a false self, because I think there is no such thing as a core or real self, which we have to find, because we always realize only certain aspects of ourselves, and the roles and the realizations that we find in life, and the roles that we take are always a certain part of ourselves which is developed and which is and in which we find ourselves. So I think there is no real distinction or separation between the way that I lead my life on the one hand and the self that is realized in my life conduct and in my roles. But there is, on the other, I would rather say there is a certain way the self realizes itself, and there is there is a scope of unrealized possibilities, and they are not the real self, but the not yet realized self. So there is a not yet in all of us. There is a space of possibility which we can unfold, and the crisis and mental illness is, of course, an opportunity, a chance to unfold more of ourselves. That is how I would put it.
Beautifully said. Yeah.
By the way, I don't have much more time. With perhaps one or two questions, but I have to get back to my family and.
Good reason. I don't know if any of you has questions here. Yeah, we can let Professor Fuchs join.
No, it's fine. I can answer one or two more.
Thank you so much for your time. I think this was very valuable for all of us. And yeah, have a good evening.
Have a good evening, everybody of you. And if you have certain questions, perhaps regarding a paper or regarding particular things that come to your mind later on, you can also write me an email, of course, and I will try to answer it or send you what you need. So you're welcome to do that. Okay?
Thanks. Very generous.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. All the best to all of us, or to all of you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.